A wonderful good morning to everybody joining us for this webinar organized by the 4i-TRACTION project. My name is Matthias Duber. I'm head of the climate team at Ecologic Institute, and I have the privilege of guiding you through our discussion on the topic, what does the 1.5 degree goal require from EU climate policy? And I should get started by telling you a little bit about 4i-TRACTION, to the extent that you don't already know what and who we are. We here at Ecologic Institute are very glad to be leading a group of 10 research organizations from around Europe that have come together under this heading of the project 4i-TRACTION that are focusing on a number of key recommendations to be realized and derived from work over the course of the next 18 months. We're essentially at the halfway point for the project. And in terms of what we have set out to do, the approach is defined by a series of sequential steps. And the starting point is in our acronym or name for the project. We have decided to take a specific lens to try and analyze the challenges that the EU will face in getting to climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest. We're using these 4 I's: infrastructure, integration, investment, and innovation as lenses through which we try to analyze and derive recommendations for how EU policy could and should change. And what we are going to be hearing about today are insights from the work that has examined pathways towards climate neutrality. What we're doing in parallel is also analyzing past policies to help us identify key factors for success and lessons to be learned from existing policy. And we're putting all of that together to arrive at recommendations for the future policy mix in the form of various potential so-called policy avenues that EU climate policy could take towards 2050. We're also going to be putting all of this into the context of considerations of how the governance system should change to accommodate these changes in policy. And in all of that work, we're trying proactively to engage with stakeholders from different constituents, from different parts of Europe, and also going beyond Europe to have a bit of global outreach here. And so this is actually the very first of our public events, and I'm very glad that we've gathered here today to be communicating to a broader audience some of the insights from the initial work of the project. And for that, our agenda has initial input from the project directly by 2 of the colleagues from climate analytics that have been analyzing 1.5 degree compatible scenarios and derived insights for what they mean for EU targets and EU pathways towards climate neutrality in particular. And we're going to be hearing from Dr. Tina Aboumahboub, who is a climate policy analyst, together with her colleague, Dr. Neil Grant. And after their initial presentation, we are glad to have 2 experts on both EU climate policy in general, but also specifically the modeling side here with us, with Mendel Trio and Elizabeth Cremona. I'm going to introduce them a little bit more when we get to them. But now I want to, without much further ado, allow us to get into the content. So one last thing before we get to the presentation is to just mention to everyone again the broad ground rules for this webinar. You are certainly all familiar with the functionality that you have in the Zoom interface here. For questions to the speakers or to our experts, for the discussion, please use the Q&A function, and you can pose your questions with your name. That would be nicer, but it's also possible to do so anonymously. Others can see your questions, can like them, therefore upvote them. We will see all that information. You can also use the chat, but please use that for commentary and not for questions, because we'll focus on those that are coming out of the Q&A function. And of course, if you have joined this meeting live, then you know this is being recorded, and we will make everything, all the material available afterwards on our website, which is 4i-traction.eu. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Neil and Tina to give us the results from their work on modeling pathways for the EU and member states that are compatible with 1.5 degree contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. I will just share my screen so that we can see our presentation. Wonderful. So yeah, again, thanks, Matthias, for that really helpful introduction and framing of the 4i-TRACTION project. So myself and my colleague Tina from Climate Analytics are now going to take you through our results, exploring this question: what does the 1.5 degree goal require from EU climate policy? So just to summarize the project, in our stage of the 4i-TRACTION project, we've been producing 1.5 compatible scenarios for the EU 27 and also for 7 selected member states, which you can see here. And these pathways are based on the latest evidence from the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which came out earlier in 2022. Our analysis explores what the 1.5 degree goal means for total greenhouse gas emissions in each country, for the power sector, and also for the end-use sectors of buildings, transport, and industry. And the results that we're presenting today are summarized in a report and 2 key policy briefs, all of which are accessible on the 4i-TRACTION website. And I think the links to these reports are going to be shared during the webinar as well. So let's talk briefly about the key findings from the project before we dive into the more in-depth methodology and results. So our key findings are as follows. First, for the 1.5 degree goal, more action is required at the EU level. So the Fit for 55 package, which is currently going through EU Parliament, is not fit for 1.5 degrees. And instead, the EU should be aiming for closer to a 65% cut in emissions relative to 1990 levels in 2030. That's the level of a 2030 NDC that would align with the 1.5 degree goal. If we look at the individual member states, of the 7 member states that we assessed, the benchmark should be north of a 50% cut in emissions from 1990 levels. Many member states can go further than this, but all states should be aiming for at least a 50% cut, which is beyond what many are currently aiming for. We then look at how that level of transformative change could be achieved. We find 3 key areas of the transformation. So first, 100% clean electricity is a key milestone on the road to net zero. And most of the member states that we assess achieve this in the 2030s. Secondly, the future is electric. In these pathways, we see huge growth in electrification of end use, with electricity heating our homes, powering our bikes and our cars, producing our industrial goods. At the same time, the future energy system can be smaller. In this project, we have found feasible routes for final energy demand in the EU 27 to be cut in half by 2050. Importantly, this doesn't represent a future with energy poverty and scarcity, but rather one in which energy efficiency, electrification, and reductions in overconsumption where necessary enable a smaller and more efficient energy system. And this reduction in demand can reduce our reliance on unproven technologies. It can accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels, and it can improve well-being. And so we're really keen that this is not forgotten as a key element of climate action. So these are our key findings. You're going to hear more about these through the rest of the presentation, but I'm now going to pass on to my colleague Tina, who's going to discuss the methodology and results further.
Thanks a lot, Neil. So Yeah, so our scenario assessment methodology. So this shows the flowchart of our methodology that we use for this scenario assessment. So we started from the latest IM scenario literature by the IPCC AR6. So the first step is the pathway selection. So we selected the pathways based on different criteria, including the compatibility with the Paris Agreement, climate target, the CDR deployment of carbon dioxide removals, and the sustainability criteria, and also the EU 27 climate policy context and the pathways which represent the highest plausible ambition for the EU 27. So the next step would be the downscaling, because these pathways from the global IM scenario literature would present the data at the European macro region level, and we downscale the pathways to the EU 27 and member state level. And the next step would be the in-depth pathway assessment. So where for a selected set of scenarios, we explore the energy transformation pathways at sectoral level and also at the EU 27, both at the EU 27 and member state level for these selected pathways. And the outcomes of these analysis would be we obtain insights on the ambition gap between the 1.5 compatible pathways and the actual NDCs and national targets. And also we derive the 1.5 compatible transformation pathways at the sectoral level for the EU 27 and each of the selected member states. The illustrative pathways which we have chosen for in-depth assessments, so they represent the highest plausible ambition for the EU 27. So they simply represent the technically and economically feasible pathway with the highest greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030, while they still meet the sustainability criteria. So these two pathways, they have been developed by the integrated assessment model Remind, which we have the full name here, and we refer to them in this presentation with the high renewable scenario, the high RE, and the sustainable development pathway. So next slide, please. So now the question is, what does the EU 27 need to do to get aligned with the 1.5 degree target? So this graph shows the 1.5 compatible greenhouse gas emissions. This is excluding LULUCF until 2050. So we see the historic data. We see what would happen if we follow the existing measures, and we see also the two illustrative pathways which we assessed here, and the NDC target. So based on this, so the 1.5 compatible range results in 64 to 67 reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, excluding LULUCF by 2030 relative to 1990 levels. And the EU 27 2030 target, which is 54% below 1990, is obviously above the selected 1.5 compatible range. And the RE EU plan would increase the 2030 target, but only to 57 to 58%, and is still, so this analysis shows that this would be still incompatible with the 1.5 degree target. And with existing measures, we see that we would be obviously above that. So the emissions in 2030 are then projected to reach only 35% below 1990 levels. So next slide, please. And then now the question is, how does this picture look like at member state level? So this graph shows the emission reductions relative to 1990 for all the selected 7 member states, which we assessed here. We see the historic data from 1990 until 2090, so the emission reductions which have been already achieved. in green, and then we see the actual targets of the different countries in purple, and the 1.5 compatible range in blue. So the range of current ambition 2030 emission reduction targets ranges between 65% for Germany, to 23% for Belgium and Spain. But when we look into the 1.5 compatible range, we would need to achieve 50% reduction. So in Belgium, up to 77% reduction for Germany. So based on this assessment, we see that none of these 7 selected member states has really a 2030 target, which is aligned with the globally cost-effective 1.5 compatible pathways. So next slide, please. So now we look into the sectoral transformation pathways, starting from the power sector. At first, we see the transformation pathways at the EU 27 level. So the left graph shows the high RE pathway, and the right one, the sustainable development pathway. And we see the transformation pathway until 2050. What is clear from these graphs is that the future power system is obviously dominated by the non-biomass renewables, and coal needs to be phased out before 2030, and the gas would be phased out by mid-2030s. And concerning the nuclear, we see that no nuclear power plants going to be installed after 2019, and nuclear is also phased out by 2050, based on both pathways. And hydrogen, which is shown here in yellow, is playing a rather limited role, but still a key role in balancing the power system. And we see, based on assessment of both pathways, so we see that the EU needs to achieve close to 100% clean power sector by 2035, so which means 97 to 99% share of renewables already by 2035. And we need to have in mind that the demand side action can strongly reduce the overall electricity demand, which facilitates the decarbonization of the power sector. So now we see the results at the member state level. So we see the key milestones in these 1.5 compatible power sector transitions at the member state level. So we see the coal phase out, which is highlighted in red, the fossil gas phase out in yellow, and the date that 100% renewable share is achieved in these member states, so in green. So when we look into the member state level results, so we see that coal-fired electricity generation needs to be phased out by 2030 in all those member states. Germany, Finland, Spain, and Netherlands have already existing or proposed coal phase-out plans by 2030, but they need to aim for accelerating this to early to mid-2020s. And the Poland's plan for continued coal generation after 2030 is obviously not compatible with the 1.5 degree target. And when we look into the fossil gas phase out, so we see that the fossil gas also needs to phase out over 2028 up to 2041. When we look into the different member state results in all those 7 countries based on the high renewable pathway, which is the more ambitious pathway when we look into these scenarios. And by phasing out coal and fossil gas, and then all these member states would achieve the 100% renewable-based power sector between 2038 and 2049.
Wonderful, thanks, Tina. I'm now going to talk a bit about the demand side transition. What does the future energy system look like when we look at buildings, industry, and transport? I think the three key words are that the future energy system is smaller, it's more electrified, and it's more renewable. So let's look at each of those in turn. So first, smaller. We find that strong reductions in final energy demand are technically feasible in the EU 27. So these two charts show the final energy mix in the EU 27 for the high renewables pathway on the left and the sustainable development pathway on the right. And we see that demand can be cut by as much as 50% in 2050 relative to 2019 levels. And this demand reduction is coming by three key actions. First, there are efficiency improvements across the system. So insulating buildings and reducing heat loss in industry and other actions can cut final energy requirements while still meeting the same level of consumer demand. Secondly, there's reductions in energy demand coming from electrification. Because heat pumps and electric vehicles are so much more efficient than boilers or petrol and diesel cars, as we electrify the energy system, the scale of energy required to meet demand falls. And in the high renewables pathway, which is shown on the left, it's these two actions together that cut final energy demand by about a third in 2050. And that's without any substantial behavioral or societal change. It's just efficiency and electrification. But it is possible to go further and reduce the total demand for travel or heating or consumer goods. And in the sustainable development pathway, it's this additional behavioral and societal change that pushes the pathway further to actually halve final energy demand by 2050. And we saw that that reduction in total energy demand reduces the scale of power sector growth required, which therefore reduces some challenges around renewables build out and permitting, which could make it easier to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. In both scenarios, whether the high renewables or the sustainable development, final energy demand falls faster by 2030 than the current EU 27 targets in the Repower EU plan. So there's scope for greater demand side ambition in the EU. Secondly, we see that the future is electrified. So electricity is providing about 2/3 of final energy in 2050. That's about 3 times the level of today. And the majority of this is direct electrification, which is shown in blue in the charts, light blue. But there is also some indirect electrification via green hydrogen, particularly in long distance transport and heavy industry. And thirdly, we see that the future is renewable. So these pathways achieve 41 to 48% of final energy from renewables in 2030. So this broadly aligns with the Repower EU target of 45% final energy being renewable in 2030. But it's important to say that action needs to really strongly continue post 2030 out to 2050. And it's this growth of renewables that drives fossil fuels out of the energy system. And so we see that in these two illustrative pathways, coal is effectively phased out of the energy system around 2030, and fossil gas is phased out by 2050. In 2050, renewables are providing around 90% of final energy demand. And that remaining fossil fuel demand is almost entirely oil, which is shown in light grey on the figures. And this remaining oil demand is concentrated in the aviation sector, where it's providing kerosene, and in the non-energy sector, where it's acting as a feedstock for chemicals production. So these are the final frontiers where innovation is needed to drive out fossil fuels and enable a fully fossil-free energy system. If we look at the same transition, but at the member state level, the two charts here show this picture. So the first chart on the left shows the level of electrification of final energy demand in each member state. We see that electrification really is taking off at the member state level, particularly post 2030. So in the 2020s, the main focus is on cleaning up the power sector. Post 2030, when there's a larger amount of clean electricity, the focus is on putting all those clean electrons into our buildings, our cars, our industry. And so you see very strong growth in electrification post 2030. The second chart on the right shows the average level of demand reduction seen in each member state across the two illustrative pathways that we focus on. And you can see that although there are strong variations from country to country, strong reductions in demand are achievable. I'm going to talk briefly about Finland, which is the area where there's the lowest potential for demand reduction. And this is due to the progress that's already been made in eliminating fossil fuels. So, for example, the building sector in Finland is predominantly powered by district heating and electrification already, with gas boilers providing a very small share. And so that means the potential to eliminate energy waste by shifting from gas boilers to heat pumps, which is a big driver of demand reduction in other countries, is less possible in Finland. And that's one of the examples why the potential for demand reduction is much smaller in Finland. But in the majority of other countries, strong reductions in final energy demand are feasible. So to conclude, before we bring in our excellent panelists and have a Q&A, I just want to highlight again the key messages of our analysis. So first of all countries need to do more to align with the 1.5 degree temperature limit. Individual member states should be aiming for at least a 50% cut in emissions by 2030 relative to 1990 levels. And the EU as a whole, if it wants to be aligned with 1.5 degrees, should be targeting a 65% emissions reduction. Secondly, when we look at the transformation required to achieve these levels of ambition, there are some clear elements that we need to be getting on with. And the three key elements that we identify in this report are to strongly reduce final energy demand through efficiency, electrification, and targeted behaviour change, to clean up the power sector and achieve a clean power sector by the 2030s. This is a key milestone on the road to net zero emissions. Third, to electrify. Widespread electrification is key in these pathways. And these three actions together can help us eliminate fossil fuel demand by 2050. There are, in some other areas, choices that still remain, and we haven't focused on this in this presentation, but I do encourage you to read the reports that we've linked in the chat, where we discuss some of these areas further, such as what level of hydrogen demand or CCS deployment, carbon capture and storage deployment, is required in these pathways, or how we might eliminate that last 5 to 10% of fossil fuel demand in 2050, or what level of biomass demand might be considered sustainable within the EU 27. But these choices that remain shouldn't be cause for complacency in decision makers and policymakers. The time has come to deliver, not just to plan the energy transition. And we really hope that the analysis we've provided in these reports will help all of us on this call in our work to try and help align the EU 27 with the Paris Agreement. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you very much and hand over to Matthias again.
Thank you so much to both Neil and Tina, obviously, for all the work that's gone into the analysis, but also for condensing the insights and a lot of work into some clear, communicatable insights and messages. And I know from me also having seen a lot of that material at previous internal meetings that some of this takes a while to take in, but you all have the chance also to engage with this material during and then after our event. The links to the respective material have already been posted. And now you have two people here with us that have already done part of that job of trying to absorb and digest these insights already and can engage directly with us. And so we're going to start with Elizabeth. At Amber, I know you're an energy and climate data analyst there. I know you do at Amber, you do a lot of data analysis based work on to derive policy recommendations. You do your own modeling. You're yourself an energy systems modeler. So, from that perspective of having done your own work on how to achieve the clean energy transition in Europe and knowing what, a lot of also the technical backdrop that for the non-modelers, sort of is a bit of a mystery what all of that means and involves. What's your take on the results coming out of the 4i-TRACTION work?
Thanks, Matthias, and thanks for having me here. I love the presentation. I thought it was a very concrete way to pull out those key results from a huge amount of work that went into analyzing these complex pathways. And to me, one of the most striking elements is, I think since the last, I'd say 2 to 5 years almost, the more energy models, the more energy scenarios we see coming out of various institutions, the more it points to these general traits that we can expect from the energy transition if we want it to be successful, have clean, affordable energy, and ultimately get us to these clean power targets. And what we have is clean electrification leading the way. So this is clear from the IPCC pathways that were analyzed here. We had the IEA net zero report coming out in 2021. At EMBA, as you mentioned, we also do our own modeling. And we recently released a report where we looked at what is the cheapest pathway to get us to 1.5C by 2050. And again, we saw across the board these same results: 2035 clean power, and the power sector leading the way in this transition, having a very central role. So it's really good to see this is reflected in the IPCC, and we get these very clear time-defined milestones, not only at EU level, but at country level. So again, this adds to the growing evidence that we need action now, essentially, because we are looking at a transition that's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years. This is when the major action will happen, which means we need to be laying the groundwork in the next 3 years if we want to actually see this, given the length of time we see infrastructure requiring, permitting, all of these more complex bureaucratic issues that need to be set in motion from now in order to actually get us to this future, which we see dramatically changing in the next decade. So it's really good to see these very concrete conclusions continuously coming out and being reflected here. So as Neil mentioned in his conclusion, this is what the next step is: action, actually delivering on these very concrete targets. There are very few things that remain not even controversial, just we're not sure about the level of where hydrogen needs to be. We're not sure about biomass, but clean electrification leading the way, combined with energy efficiency, is now a concrete target. So this is what we need to see reflected in EU ambition now. And with the crisis in cost of living, with the escalation of Russia's war in Ukraine, energy is continuously at the forefront of the discussions at EU level. So at this moment of plasticity in terms of discussions, a lot around Repower EU, it's a very clear and opportunistic moment to actually embed these much higher concrete targets into the EU debate and ultimately into action. So energy ministers, when they go to these discussions, not only have the potential to set out this clear path in terms of energy, but they're also weighed down by the fact that ultimately in making these decisions about energy, it's very much related to the cost of living crisis affecting so many people across the continent, and ultimately funding Russia's war in Ukraine as well. So there are so many elements, and ultimately it comes down to these very concrete, tangible goals which you could achieve and need to be moving towards in the next decade. So the action that needs to actually take place must be embedded into the legislation, into the EU targets right now. So I think the years 2022, possibly 23, 24 are actually going to set out whether or not the EU will commit to these higher targets from -55 to -65, which is a huge jump. But over the years, since 2019, for instance, we've already seen it move from -40 to -55. Therefore, it's very realistic and possible that we see it move from -55 to -65. And this is where we need to keep pushing. A final word, as I don't take too long, but I'm very happy to come back to then talking about the more technical issues related to the power sector, as this is really where EMBA's focus is. It's more about the overall EU ambition, which is net zero by 2050. And I think the more we see emerging from these energy pathways, the more it's clear that just committing to net zero in the year of 2050 is not enough. It's not enough to keep us aligned to 1.5C. And therefore, we need to be looking at our overall trajectory, getting us to that zero in 2050. So it's not about keeping the line up here and then suddenly dashing down to net zero in 2050. We need to be looking at the overall pathway to get us there. And this is really where, in the charts that you showed in the presentation, we saw that massive decline in the years 2020 to 2035. So it's really the key decade for action there.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. If I may directly, just a quick follow-up. You alluded to both kind of the technical side and the political implications, focusing on the technical side and your own work. So, here we have an approach that takes, the global modeling, breaks it down to the European macroeconomic region and also the member state level. And so may I ask, in terms of the modeling that underpins your own analysis at Amber, that you were saying, is arriving at some similar results, or at least similar pathways and similar timing, that I assume is built, is that built up in the same way, or do you use basically a significantly different methodology that's more kind of bottom-up, EU focused, to arrive at very similar results?
Yes, as you said, it's more bottom-up in the sense that we modeled specifically at country level, and because we were looking at the power system, which is very, you need to look at it in terms of the resilience and the continuous reliability, we also modeled it on an hourly basis. So we looked at the country's different power demands between 2020 and 2050, looked at the different end uses where we can see different trends emerging. So as we increasingly electrify, you're going to expect different electricity demand at certain hours. So the more you electrify heating, the more you see certain hours increasing in demand. And this is where we modeled. So we have this individual member state level data, and we kind of put it into the overall model and said, to get to a 1.5C pathway, looking at also net zero in 2050, what's the best way to meet this power demand at the overall European level? And ultimately what we got in the over 20 pathways that we looked at essentially is continuously this emerging trend of about 95% clean power by 2035. So this is not only the best way in terms of meeting the climate ambition, but it was the cheapest way to reach these climate targets, which is essentially where we need to be heading, not only looking at energy as a climate issue, but as an economy and security issue.
Yeah. Thank you. That is, I think, sort of that is important to underpin in terms of validation of the results, from different sources, certainly on the timing and the key message on clean power, in the EU as the key driver for everything else. I'm going to move over to Wendell Trio, now an independent climate expert, but for a decade head of Climate Action Network Europe in Brussels, and previously and currently involved with Greenpeace International. Wendell, you have also engaged yourself and helped to get off the ground work on different, more ambitious modeling for the EU that is more in line with 1.5 degrees. So in the background of that work, and of course also with your political experience, what is your takeaway from the results coming out of the work presented by Neil and Tina?
Yes, thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Neil and Tina, for this interesting and great presentation. I think it's really extremely useful. Just a couple of comments and observations from my side. First and foremost, I think it's very important that this presentation is really about 1.5. I think we cannot stress the importance of these 1.5 limits after the devastating impacts that we've witnessed the last couple of months all over the world, with current increase of 1.1 degrees, and also looking forward to another climate summit, COP27, taking place in Africa, where climate impact will be front and center. So 1.5, extremely important, and extremely important that this study also, this presentation proves that it is still feasible and that the EU can still contribute to moving towards 1.5. And that's very important as a message. This other part of the message, of course, is that it needs transformative change. And I think that should be clear front and center as a message to all the decision makers in the EU and in the member states, that we need courageous, consistent, long-term decision making to make this transformation happen. And unfortunately, the EU is not always strong in doing that. I think the current response to the energy crisis is a clear indication. Renewables and energy efficiency, energy demand reduction are front and center in the narrative around the response to the energy crisis, but the action is not necessarily focused on renewables and efficiency, but rather on continuing or even expanding fossil fuel subsidies and exploration and so on and so on. So I think that's a very important message from these scenarios and pathways, is that we need long-term thinking, long-term decision-making in a cohesive and consistent way. It's very important that the scenarios or the pathways that were selected, the high renewables and sustainable development ones, are focusing on action that is taken now, not banking on carbon dioxide removal happening at a later stage. It's very good that we keep being realistic about the potential of going into net negative emissions, etc. Later on. So let's really look at what can happen now. And it's extremely interesting to see those two scenarios, one with very high renewable production and one which has more focus on energy demand reduction. In fact, what we need, I believe, is a combination of those two. It's the two pathways make it clear what is possible. And in the end, in terms of real policies, we will need high renewables penetration, but with very extreme low energy demand, if we are also to take into account the potential negative impacts on resource extraction, etc., of renewables development, which will be there. So the combination of the two is extremely important. And there, of course, in terms of policy making, while these pathways on a global scale very much focus around cost efficiency, policy making needs to go a different way. I mean, if we're purely banking on cost efficiency in EU policy, which mainly is, of course, the emissions trading system, then we're not going to get there. What we've seen with the energy demand reduction policy, where we're missing binding targets, both at the EU level, but also at the national level, is that we're missing a lot of opportunities, and we can't afford that. So we need much more stringent EU policies that really focus on how can we ensure the highest possible renewable energy development and the highest possible energy demand reduction, which is more than energy efficiency. It's really about how do we reduce energy demand. And I think that's where the policy challenge is. And how do we develop policies that go beyond just emissions trading into really ensuring that those two strategies really happen. And then maybe just my last remark on this, of course, going beyond cost efficiency also means, in terms of the global responsibility, that the EU has a much bigger responsibility than what is currently proposed in these two scenarios, because this is the EU contribution in terms of emission reduction, but we also have a strong responsibility in terms of providing climate finance for making these cost-efficient reductions happen in poorer countries in the world. So that's another part. It's not part of this this presentation, but it's another part that is extremely important to keep in mind, that we also, as EU, have a responsibility at that level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, indeed, Wendell, for sort of distilling the essence of what the results mean. I think in particular, and also putting that in the context of what the parameters are that have informed the choice of the scenarios, and therefore also inform what the results are, or they shape what results we're looking at, and the strong transformative character that these changes that would be required to even have I think it is the member states results basically have almost the fastest pace in Poland, because it is so the power system is still at a higher percentage of coal than a number of the other countries that were being looked at, and they would actually, with that fast paced transformation, be the first ones to be at clean power, under the modeling results. I think that goes to show, sort of what a significant change it is, and how fast it would need to happen. And I realize that we have a number of questions that have arrived through the Q&A tool. Keep those coming. Tina and Neil have both been engaged in answering some of the more technical questions directly in that tool. But we do have some of the ones that are left are looking beyond the modeling to implementation. And here I would ask, and this is to all of you, considering the current context, which is both, of course, the frenzy of trying to react and to the current crisis, but at the same time we're essentially at the end of a negotiation process at the EU level with Fit for 55, where the EU has increased its 2030 target already, is now almost about to settle on the specifics in terms of policies. But we are now, on the basis of these results, are saying all of this is basically still not good enough. What are the likely political processes through, in this context, decisions on new and more ambitious target and implementation packages can be taken? Is there an impulse from the international process that we could need, or a hook through the setting of 2035 NDC, or the hook of the process for proposing and deciding on a 2040 target for the EU? Where do you see that we can insert these results and these insights, and where the discussion can be taken to the next level? I don't know, Wendell, but everybody else here as well, if you have any initial thoughts on how these insights can actually be picked up by the political processes, considering where we are right now.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. Looking at the international level, there are currently multiple avenues where kind of these messages are important, at least within the process of the UN climate negotiations, as there is a process specifically looking at what needs to happen in the short term. And I think that's extremely important to have this message come in there in terms of what needs to happen between now and 2030. Then you have a second process, which is called the global stocktake in more technical terms, which is looking at setting a new target for 2035. And that process, the first phase of that, will end next year. So very soon the EU will be starting discussing a 2035 greenhouse gas emission reduction target. It will be important to ensure that the debate about 2035 doesn't take away the importance of action needing to happen in the short term. I think that's a bit the challenge. And then there's a third process in the UN, which looks more at what needs to happen in the longer term, which is the second periodic review of the long-term goal. But also there, it's very important to bring in that message of the feasibility of 1.5 degrees target and what needs to happen in different countries and regions. So there's multiple opportunities there, but that's only one part of the debate, because in the end, whatever is being debated at the international level, what really matters is how is it translated at the national level. And there, I think, unfortunately, while the process is not finished yet, but we're missing a couple of opportunities, both in terms of the debates around the Fit for 55 package, as well as in the debate around the Repower EU package, where I believe, coming back to what I said earlier, that we really need stronger policies beyond the emissions trading scheme, not replacing, but beyond the emissions trading scheme, in terms of setting clear targets for renewables and energy efficiency. And we've seen the debate over the last couple of weeks and months in terms of the reaction to the Russian invasion to Ukraine, where the Commission has been proposing binding energy demand reduction targets, and where we've seen member states being very reluctant to that. And I think that's where, at a certain moment, we need to overcome that. We need countries to agree that binding targets for renewables and energy efficiency is still a good way forward.
Thank you very much, Wendell. Would any one of the other colleagues want to react? Yeah.
one thing I just want to add, so I'd really agree with all that Wendell said in terms of, even post 2030, every bit of emissions reductions that we are able to advocate for and achieve in terms of incrementing up policy ambition makes a difference. And so, although we focus in this presentation on 2030, there are numbers in the report for what a 2035 or a 2040 target should also look like, and we absolutely should be using those numbers as well. I guess another place for me, the conversation at the EU level may be sort of drawing towards the end of a particular phase with the Fit for 55 negotiations, but at the member state level, with the drafting of new national energy and climate plans, that conversation is maybe just beginning again. And so I think that message that actually if individual member states are serious about the 1.5 degree goal, they need to not just be looking to align their NECPs with the Fit for 55 target, but they need to be looking to go beyond it. And maybe actually we see that ambition for the EU as a whole coming from individual member states. That's a place where I think these messages need to really be hammered home in the coming 6 to 12 months.
Thank you very much, Neil. Yeah, that was a very good point. Indeed, member states, or at least in terms of the obligation they have towards that governance system that it's been put in place across the EU, the obligation to actually revise and update and then communicate in writing specifically how they're planning to achieve their increased 2030 targets. And so there is a live process in which key decisions will be taken across the EU over the indeed next year and a half. Elizabeth, also from you, any additional thoughts on how to connect to the political process, or how the policies need to change to help trigger this transformation?
Yes, just to add my agreement to what Wendell and Neil have said, and to kind of make it clear that although we always talk about EU negotiations, ultimately the commitments and the action come from the individual member states. At this point, there is nothing actually stopping a member state from coming out and saying, the EU may be aiming for -55, but I'm going to go for -100. It's entirely possible at this point. So we are seeing some progress in this regard. We have had the G7 committing to achieving a predominantly decarbonized power system by 2035. So there are some countries that are prepared, at least at the political level, to take this increased ambition forward. I hope we see this very clearly reflected in their NECPs. And given that the countries are currently preparing these new national plans, now is a very good moment to start to embed these higher targets, even if they are not necessarily reflected at the EU level. Ultimately, it is the country and its citizens that will benefit from these increased ambitions. So this is kind of the last remaining pillar, like what is required to convince politicians that this is the right move forward. And the crisis that we are in at the moment cannot be any clearer in this regard. So we will hopefully see these higher ambitions.
Thank you very much. And I think you've phrased it like this in your earlier intervention, that indeed going the renewables pathway is basically the cheapest option to achieve these goals. And I think that is a message that is worth repeating in this context. I know that there was a more technical question among the ones that are now, I think, officially counted as answered in our Q&A system that was trying to address this. And so I'm giving the question back to Neil and Tina about how the models that you analyzed, how do they treat the technological development and the price development of clean technologies? So is there basically an effect that the models anticipate and then project that you're reaching a point, and I know for clean power we have essentially reached that point already, where compared to conservative means of producing power, there's basically a runaway effect where the cost is such that you may have a snowballing effect. A threshold is reached and the costs coming down further and cheaper, helping actually then make the fast transition possible. So actually, if I boil that down to more, a more specific, more technical question is, how do the models and the scenarios that you looked at anticipate the price development of clean technologies?
That's a great question. I can put a couple of thoughts in. So both of the pathways that we look at here for if we focus on the power sector first, they have what we call endogenous learning. So that means in the model, the more that you deploy wind and solar, the cheaper it gets, and therefore the more the model can deploy again. And so they do capture that sort of, it's this positive spiral that, the more that we deploy clean tech, the cheaper it gets, and that makes it easier to deploy even more. Particularly that high renewables scenario, I guess, couples that ambitious picture on wind and solar deployment with where the cost of wind and solar reaches very low levels by 2050. It couples that with the really important demand side innovations that are needed, because loads of cheap wind and solar is only going to really help us if we have the innovations to get that into our buildings and our industry and our transport systems. So it's cheap heat pumps and the continuing fall in cost of electric vehicles and industrial heat pumps for sort of low temperature heat in industry. And so that pathway in particular sort of also couples in that really important demand side innovation, which is why we see the most transformative level of electrification in that pathway.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. Thank you to all of you for your inputs here as the speakers that I see in front of me, and thanks also to the many questions that were received. In terms of a bit of a forward-looking perspective to close out our 1 hour that we had with each other, I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, that this work on the pathways is helping inform additional research going on under 4i-TRACTION that is wanting to arrive at policy recommendations, how the transformation at the scale and at the speed at which we're talking about can be realized, what additional policies are required, what changes to the existing policy mix, along the lines of what Wendell talked about, not focusing only on the cost efficiency as a key driver, but really effectiveness at the scale and speed required is in something that the project is looking at and will have results, are already engaging also with relevant experts and stakeholders on these questions. And we're also going to try and consider specifically the governance context, considering the political conditions, scenarios about how things are going to develop from here on out, what political strategies could be that help steer a relatively robust and clear pathway towards climate neutrality. So stay tuned. Watch out for additional invites for outputs from the 4i-TRACTION project on our Twitter feed, on our website. Those that got here and allowed us to contact them again via email will also receive these invitations directly. So we're looking forward to engaging further on these issues with everybody. Thank you so much for your attention and thank you for your participation. And we look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if our dear colleagues could stop the broadcast.